Hi. How are you doing? I feel like I've left you hanging. So this is an part of something that if we had had a chance for a more in-depth conversation, I probably could have covered this. So I'm glad you keep following up. That's really good. Excuse me. The wind and the pollen. I'm afraid to go outside today because of how much it's affecting my allergies. So when you're looking at different bodies of literature, different disciplines or fields of study, they might present it in different ways. So in law or discussions of legal policy and things like that, they often consider what's going on right now with what's happened in the past and what we hope to do in the future, all in one fell swoop. If you go to STEM or some of the social sciences, it will be here's the problem and here's an intervention, and then it's going to be just like polarized on one side. Law tends to go back and forth and consider both options. Almost like you've come to a fork in the road and you're like, well, should we go this way, what we did in the past? And there's lots of back and forth conversation in every single article. So what I would recommend that you do, if I'm reading your question right, is we want to find those points of view. So I've opened up a couple of articles here that I sent in the last email. Owing to the extreme youth of the accused and support for balanced juvenile justice. In scholarship, especially in law, precedent is a big, big deal. Like what happened before and why did it change? So if you go into these articles, you just have to read the first page or so. So the abstract, sometimes it's good. But if you go in to this particular article, there's an introduction that talks about, like one right here, the guiding doctrine of the state as parent. So the precedent, and I guess this was back in like the 30s and 40s. The next article talks about this more. But back in the 30s and 40s, they're like the idea of children was still being kind of talked about, sociology, psychology, that sort of a thing. And in fact, if you go 100 years before that, there really wasn't children. It was just like, they had child labor, but they were just like, well, it's just labor. Like 3-year-olds were working as chimney sweeps, apparently, which just sounds, can you imagine managing a 3-year-old? Woo! Giving them a job as a chimney sweep. At any rate, the world is always changing, and they typically reflect and look back in their literature review. So state as a parent is progressive era, 30s, 40s, 50s, 30s, 40s, where they're like, well, these children are just naughty because they don't have a good parent, and so the state will be a parent. And so it's like rehabilitation, less than punishment. So that's kind of like the you could take that either side, but as you read through these, you'll see trying as an adult versus trying as a child, punishment versus rehabilitation, and you'll have to find these nuanced quotes that you think support that. When I went down to background, this gives a really good history. So they're talking about saving children. This is that state as parent. And they talk about why don't we treat these juvenile offenders as we deal with neglected children. So that might be a pro or a con. You could pick on that in either side. And this is where you'd have to have like a critical analysis and like have a position. This is something that your instructor might help you with, since it's kind of like we're negotiating a trail, but it's kind of like there's both sides to the issue being enacted all the time. It's not like yes or no. It's kind of like, well, maybe a little this and a little bit of that. The next article, and you could do this with all four, just do some close reading. But this one has some lovely quotes at the beginning. Our Juvenile Criminal Act was written at a time when kids were knocking over outhouses, not killing people. We're looking at a whole new breed here. So there's an opinion of just like, we need more punishment. And here they're talking about violent crime. So is the difference between a traditional or a blended more about like the severity of the crime. And on this one, here they start off. In the late 80s and 90s, there was an alarming increase of the number of juvenile homicides. That's something you could say is a point of why they would move towards more of a blended. So even though they're not deliberately saying one thing, it's a criminal analysis, and then in the context of this article, they're moving to that point. Does that make sense? The lawyers have kind of this way of not really coming to the point, but they're building up evidence where the judge or the jury can decide for themselves. And so I don't know if that helps, but talking it through with me, reading through these and highlighting examples like I've done is a good way to go. I heard about the super predator in a different article. Ooh, that's fascinating. At any rate, you don't have to read the whole thing because eventually you'll get into these moments where it's methodology or a lot of data. So you should be able to get it in the first 3 pages or so, but look for that literature review or the history or the background. And that might give you the points back and forth in the same article. Okay, let me know how it goes.